My name is Silas. For 15 years, I've worked for National Forestry Risk Assessment, a private firm hired by major insurance conglomerates to determine the financial fallout after nature decides to tear itself apart. My job is simple. I arrive after the winds die down, map the devastation, and calculate the dollar value of the timber now rotting on the forest floor. Usually, it's a soul-crushingly dull job. It's mud, mosquitoes, and the smell of wet wood. But what I discovered 3 weeks ago in the deep folds of the Appalachian Mountains, in an area unofficially dubbed the Blind Sector by mapping crews, shattered every understanding I had of the natural world. It began after Hurricane Elowen swept through the East Coast. It wasn't a typical storm. It didn't have record-breaking wind speeds, but it carried a freakishly low barometric pressure, the kind that makes your ears pop and your heart feel like it's being squeezed by an invisible hand. When the storm crossed the Appalachian Ridge, it simply vanished from radar, leaving behind a silence more terrifying than the wind itself. Headquarters assigned me to Sector 4, a hidden valley rarely visited by hikers due to its treacherous terrain and total lack of cellular service. I drove my Ford F-150 through trails nearly erased by rock slides, deeper into a place where the oaks and maples grew so thick that high noon felt like an eternal twilight. As I stepped out of my truck, the first thing I noticed was the sound, or rather, the absence of it. The Appalachians in autumn should be loud. There should be the chatter of squirrels, the scolding of blue jays, or at least the hum of insects. But in Sector 4, everything was mute. The air felt thick and heavy, carrying a scent that was wrong. It wasn't the usual smell of decaying mulch. It was sweeter, almost like raw meat washed in rose water. I threw on my neon vest, grabbed my laser compass, and began the trek uphill. My task was to conduct sample surveys on the fallen plots. After 30 minutes of climbing, I reached a grove of ancient oaks that must have stood there for a century. The storm had dropped them like a row of dominoes. Dozens of giants lay in a strange, circular pattern. I knelt by one of the largest oaks, intending to measure the trunk's diameter. But as my eyes followed the base of the tree toward the ground, my breath hitched. The tree hadn't snapped. It had been uprooted entirely. Yet there was no massive crater beneath it, no taproots plunging into the earth. Instinctively, I brushed away the pile of rotting maple leaves beneath the trunk. Instead of finding hard, woody roots, my fingers touched something soft, rubbery, and warm. It was a vein. Thousands of pale, white fibers, thin as nylon thread but strong as cables, sprouted from the base of the tree. These fibers didn't grow into the soil. They clung to the surface like tiny tentacles, siphoning something from the earth. And as I pressed one of these fibers with the tip of my boot, I felt it. Thump, thump, thump. A slow, rhythmic vibration, a heartbeat. I didn't run toward my truck. The metallic screeching coming from that direction sounded like teeth grinding on a dumpster, and I wasn't ready to find out what was making it. Instead, I scrambled up a steep limestone ridge toward an old fire lookout tower I had spotted on my topographical map earlier. It was a relic from the 1970s, abandoned for decades, but it was high ground, and in a forest that was beginning to pulse beneath my feet. high ground was the only thing that felt like a prayer. As I climbed the rusting steel stairs, the sweet smell began to fade, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of old blood and ozone. I reached the glass-walled cabin at the top and kicked the door open. The interior was a time capsule of rot, yellowed maps, a broken radio, and a thick layer of dust. But on the center desk, sitting perfectly clean as if someone had placed it there an hour ago, was a black, leather-bound ledger. I opened it, my hands shaking so hard I nearly tore the pages. It wasn't a ranger's log. It was a research journal labeled Project Timber, Phase 4. Location: the Blind Sector. The entries were clinical, cold, and horrifying. Day 42. The graft has been successful. The Appalachian soil in Sector 4 proves to be the perfect substrate for the mycelial engine. We no longer need to plant individual units. The organism is now self-propagating. It mimics the local flora, oaks, maples, birches, with 98% visual accuracy. However, the internal structure remains 100% biomass. My stomach churned. I turned the pages, finding hand-drawn sketches of what I had seen under the tree. The scientist had labeled those white, pulsating fibers as the nervous system of the valley. One entry from November 1978 chilled me to the bone. The organism has begun to exhibit predatory behavior. It is no longer satisfied with soil nutrients. It requires complex protein. When the wind dies down and the silence takes over, the forest is feeding. We have lost 3 surveyors this month. We didn't bother looking for them. We know they are part of the canopy now. A sudden thud vibrated through the floorboards of the tower. I looked out the cracked glass windows. The sun was setting, casting a bruised purple light over the valley. From this height, I could see the truth. The fallen trees I had surveyed earlier weren't just laying there. They were moving. They were dragging themselves across the forest floor, using those white fibers like the legs of a centipede, converging on the base of the tower. And they weren't alone. Down in the clearing, I saw my Ford F-150. The hood was ripped open, but not by a tool. It looked like it had been bitten. Thick, pale vines were growing out of the engine block, weaving through the chassis, turning my truck into a mechanical carcass, being absorbed by the woods. Then, I heard it. A voice. It was coming from the old radio on the desk. A radio that wasn't plugged into any power source. Silas. The voice was thin, raspy, like dry leaves scraping against a gravestone. It sounded exactly like my father, who had been dead for 10 years. Silas, don't stay in the tower. The roots, they don't grow from the ground. They grow from the air. Look up, Silas. Look up. Slowly, I tilted my head back. The ceiling of the lookout cabin wasn't made of wood or tin anymore. It was a web of pulsating white veins, dripping a thick, translucent sap onto the floor. And hanging from the center of the web, encased in a waxy, translucent cocoon, was the surveyor who had gone missing in this sector 3 weeks ago. His eyes were wide open. He was still alive. And as he looked at me, his mouth opened to scream, but only that sweet, sickly scent came out. The tower groaned, a deep, metallic shriek that vibrated through the soles of my boots. wasn't the wind. There was no wind. It was the sound of the steel legs being constricted. I looked down through the gaps in the floorboards and saw them. The white, ropey veins were coiling around the tower's base like pythons, pulling the entire structure toward the breathing earth. The surveyor in the ceiling, the man trapped in the waxy cocoon, began to twitch. His skin was pulsing in sync with the forest below. He wasn't just a victim, he was a bridge. Through his open, glazed eyes, I felt the forest staring at me. It wasn't a mind I could understand, but I felt its hunger. It was a cold, ancient curiosity. "I'm sorry," I whispered to the man, though I knew he was already gone. I grabbed the leather-bound ledger and shoved it into my vest. If I died here, this secret would die with me. But if I survived, this was my only leverage against the firm that had sent me here to die. I kicked the glass out of the south-facing window. The staircase was no longer an option. The white fibers had woven a solid wall of biological webbing over the exit. My only way out was a 60-foot drop into the canopy of a tree that I now knew was a predatory organism. I tied a surveyor's nylon rope to the heavy iron desk, looped it around my waist, and slid out into the freezing Appalachian night. As I descended, the sweet scent became a physical weight. It coated my lungs, making every breath feel like I was inhaling syrup. Halfway down, the rope jerked. I looked up and saw a pale, translucent hand reach out from the tower's window. It was the surveyor. He had broken free of the cocoon, but his movements were wrong, jerky, like a puppet being pulled by invisible strings. He wasn't trying to save himself. He was reaching for my rope with fingers that had grown into long, jagged needles of bone. Snap. The rope went slack. I plummeted. The rope went slack. I plummeted. I didn't hit the ground. I hit something soft, wet, and incredibly warm. I had landed in the crown of one of the mimicked oaks, but there were no leaves. My hands sank into a thick carpet of moss that felt like velvet-covered flesh. Below me, the branches began to curl inward. They weren't wood. They were cartilage, flexible and incredibly strong. I scrambled toward the trunk, my boots sliding on the waxy surface. I could hear the heartbeat of the tree now. Not a single thump, but a frantic, buzzing rhythm, like a hive of bees. "Silas, stay." The voice came again, not from the radio this time, but from the very trunk I was holding onto. The bark shifted, forming a hollow that looked terrifyingly like a human mouth. "We are the wood. We are the history." I pulled my emergency flare gun from my belt. My hands were slick with the tree's sap, which was starting to burn my skin like a mild acid. I didn't aim at the mouth. I aimed at the base of the branches, where the white fibers were thickest. Whoosh! The magnesium flare ignited in a blinding burst of red light. The reaction was instantaneous. The tree didn't catch fire like normal wood. It screamed, a high-pitched subsonic wail that vibrated in my teeth. The branches thrashed wildly, throwing me off. I hit the forest floor hard, the air leaving my lungs in a painful gasp. I didn't wait to recover. I rolled to my feet and ran. The floor of Sector 4 was no longer a forest. It was a sea of moving biomass. In the red glow of my fading flare, I saw the fallen trees from earlier. They had fully uprooted themselves, were standing on their white, fibrous legs, 20 feet tall, lumbering through the dark like blind giants. They weren't looking for me with eyes. They were sensing the vibrations of my footsteps. I remembered the yellow memo. Do not establish physical contact. Do not use magnetic compasses. I threw my compass away. It was spinning in useless circles anyway. I closed my eyes for a second, trying to remember the topography of the valley before the world went mad. To the west was the river, the Blackwater Run. If the organism was a single mycelial network, maybe the running water of the river would act as a barrier. I ran toward the sound of distant rushing water, but the forest was rearranging itself. Every time I passed a birch, it seemed to slide behind me, blocking my retreat. The trees were herding me. They were pushing me away from the river and deeper into the blind sector, toward the center of the valley where the Kabut mist was thickest. That's when I saw it. In the middle of a clearing stood a house, a perfectly normal, white picket fence suburban house, looking like it belonged in the middle of a 1950s neighborhood, not the deep Appalachian woods. But as I got closer, I saw the truth. The house wasn't made of wood or brick, it was grown. The siding was layers of dried skin. The windows were thick, translucent membranes of ice-cold bile. And standing on the porch was my truck, my Ford F-150, now completely encased in white fibers, its headlights glowing with a dim, sickly green light. The driver's side door opened slowly. "Get in, Silas," the truck's radio crackled. "We're going home." "Get in, Silas. We're going home." I stood frozen in the clearing, my breath hitching in my throat as the house pulsated. It was a masterpiece of biological camouflage. From a distance, it was a dream of domestic safety. Up close, it was a digestive tract. The picket fence was actually jagged rows of bleached animal bones, sharpened to points and driven into the soft, breathing earth. The truck, my truck, sat idling on the porch of skin, its engine making a wet, gurgling sound. The headlights flickered like dying eyes. I knew it was a trap, a lure meant to bring me into the reach of the house. But the forest behind me was closing in. The lumbering giants, those 20-foot-tall mockeries of oak trees, were only yards away now, their white, fibrous limbs sweeping through the undergrowth. I didn't get in the truck. Instead, I dove for the porch, rolling under the waxy siding of the house, just as a massive, pale branch smashed into the F-150's roof, crushing it like a tin can. I scrambled into a gap in the house's foundation. Inside, the smell of roses and raw meat was so thick, I vomited. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing a living room where the furniture was grown directly out of the floor. A sofa made of velvet soft muscle. A television whose screen was a massive milky eye that tracked my every movement. This wasn't just a predator. This was a library. I pulled out the leather-bound ledger from Project Timber. I needed to understand the why. I flipped toward the end of the journal, past the sketches of root systems, and into the final, frantic notes of a lead researcher named Dr. Aris Thorne. Day 114. We were wrong. It doesn't just mimic trees, it mimics our desires. The mycelial engine has accessed the Surveyor's memories through the neural graphs. It is building a collection of humanity. It believes that by replicating our structures, our homes, our tools, it can become the dominant species above the soil. It is not destroying us. It is archiving us. A wet, sliding sound came from the corner of the room. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It looked like Dr. Thorne. He was wearing a lab coat made of thin, dried membrane. His face was a perfect mask of a middle-aged man, but his eyes were wrong. They didn't have pupils, just swirling vortexes of white fiber. "Silas," the Thorne thing said. Its voice didn't come from its mouth. It resonated from the walls of the house itself. "You are late for the census. We need your data. We need to know how it feels to lose a child. We need to know the texture of your grief. That is the only part of the human timber we haven't perfected yet." I backed away, my heel sinking into the carpet, which felt like a layer of human tongues. "You're not real. This is all just a biological fluke, a mutation." The Thorne thing tilted its head, a sickeningly human gesture. "Mutation is just a word for progress. The Appalachians have been hungry for a long time, Silas. We are just the mouth that finally grew teeth." I realized then that the house wasn't just a shelter. I felt a sharp sting in my ankle. I looked down and saw thin, white threads, the same fibers from the trees, boring through my leather boots and into my skin. The house was starting to graft me into the floorboards. I didn't panic. I remembered the flare gun. I had one shot left. But I didn't aim at Thorne. I aimed at the television, the massive eye in the center of the room. If this thing was a network, the eye was a primary sensor. I pulled the trigger. The flare hit the eye with a wet squelch. The house didn't just scream, it convulsed. The walls of skin rippled, the ceiling collapsed into a mess of bloody sap, and the Thorne thing dissolved into a pile of white worms. The graft in my ankle snapped as I threw myself through the membrane of the front window. I landed on the bone fence, slicing my palms, but I didn't stop. I ran toward the only thing that wasn't moving. A narrow, rocky creek bed behind the house. Running water. Dr. Thorne's notes mentioned that the mycelial engine couldn't bridge moving currents because the ions in the water disrupted the electrical signals of the fibers. I hit the water, the cold Appalachian stream shocking my system. I waded into the middle, the current pulling at my waist. On the banks, the forest was in a frenzy. Thousands of white fibers surged to the water's edge, but as soon as they touched the rushing stream, they shriveled and turned black. I waded through the black water run for miles, my body numb from the glacial temperature of the Appalachian spring water. Every time I tried to step onto the muddy banks, I saw the white threads, those nerves of the valley, twitching just beneath the surface of the soil, waiting for the vibration of my footfall. The river was my only sanctuary, a moving boundary of liquid silver that the mycelial engine couldn't bridge. But while the water kept the forest at bay, it couldn't stop what was already inside me. The sting in my ankle, where the house graft had pierced my skin, had transformed into a dull, rhythmic throb. It wasn't the throbbing of an infection. It was a counterbeat to my own heart. I leaned against a large, moss-covered boulder in the middle of the stream and pulled back my soaked boot. The sight made me gag. The wound wasn't red or inflamed. The skin around the puncture was turning a translucent, waxy white, and beneath the surface, I could see thin, pale filaments spreading upward toward my calf, like a web of frozen lightning. They weren't just under my skin. They were replacing my veins. "Not now," I hissed, rubbing the area with freezing water. "Not yet." As the sun dipped below the jagged horizon of the ridges, the sweet scent returned. But it wasn't coming from the trees anymore. It was coming from my own sweat. I looked at the leather ledger I had taken from the tower. I needed to know how much time I had. I flipped to the very last page, a section titled Subject Integration Symptoms. Phase 1, Sensory Overlap. The subject begins to hear the frequency of the network. Sounds of nature will be replaced by a singular, harmonic hum. Phase 2, Biological Proxy. The subject's nervous system becomes a node. The forest no longer needs to hunt the subject. It can simply call them home. I dropped the book into the water in a panic, then quickly fished it out, dripping and smeared. I couldn't lose the only proof of what was happening. That was when the humming started. It wasn't a sound I heard with my ears. It was a vibration in my bone marrow. It was the sound of 1,000 trees breathing in unison, a low-frequency growl that seemed to vibrate the very water around my legs. "Silas, look at the stones." The voice wasn't my father's anymore. It was mine. My own voice, sounding perfectly clear, as if I were standing right behind myself. I looked down at the riverbed. The stones beneath the rushing water were shifting. They weren't stones. They were calcified nodes, round, bone-like growths that the river had smoothed over decades. As the hum intensified, the nodes began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent green light. The river wasn't a barrier. It was a filter. The Project Timber notes were wrong, or perhaps they were a lie planted for anyone who found them. The running water didn't kill the fibers, it cleaned them. It carried the spores of the engine downstream, infecting every creek, every lake, and every faucet in the Appalachian watershed. I looked at my hands. The fingernails were starting to turn brittle, resembling the waxy bark of a birch tree. "I have to get to the main road," I whispered to the empty air. "I have to warn the town." But as I looked downstream, I saw something that broke my spirit. A bridge, the old Route 12 overpass. It was a massive concrete structure that should have represented civilization. But the bridge was covered in a canopy of oaks. The concrete was being cracked open by massive, fleshy roots that dripped with that same rosemeat sap. On the bridge, I saw several figures. They looked like state troopers, their cars idling with their lights flashing. But the lights weren't blue and red. They were that same sickly, bioluminescent green. The troopers stood perfectly still, their backs to me. They weren't guarding the bridge. They were waiting for the timber to finish growing. "Silas, over here." A different voice. Sharp. Real. I turned my head toward the eastern bank. Standing in the shadows of a limestone cave was a woman. She was wearing an old, tattered park ranger uniform, but it was from an era long gone. The patches were faded, the fabric held together by duct tape. She held a heavy, industrial-grade flamethrower in her hands. "Get out of the water, you idiot," she yelled. "The river is how they taste you. Get to the cave now." I didn't think. I lunged for the bank, ignoring the white fibers that lashed at my boots like whips. I scrambled into the cave, and the woman immediately pulled a heavy iron grate shut, dousing the entrance with a mixture of gasoline and something that smelled like vinegar. "Who are you?" I gasped, clutching my throbbing ankle. The woman looked at me, her face a map of scars and soot. She looked at my waxy skin and the white filaments in my leg. "I'm the surveyor who didn't get out in '78, she said, her voice like sandpaper. "And if you want to keep that leg, we have to cut it out before the forest finishes the graft." The cave didn't smell like the forest. It smelled of scorched earth, ammonia, and old grease. It was a pocket of defiance in a world that was turning into a digestive tract. The woman, who introduced herself only as Sarah, didn't waste time. She pushed me onto a rusted metal cot and tied a leather strap around my thigh. "The Project Timber notes you're carrying," she said, nodding toward my vest as she sharpened a jagged hunting knife over a small butane stove. Those were written by men who thought they could control a god. They thought the mycelial engine was a weapon. They didn't realize it was a replacement. "What do you mean, a replacement?" I groaned, the pulsing in my ankle now so loud I could hear it echoing off the cave walls. "The Appalachians are the oldest mountains on Earth," Sarah whispered, her eyes fixed on the white filaments under my skin. "Something lived here before the dinosaurs. Something that doesn't understand individuals. It only understands biomass. It went dormant for millions of years, and our government woke it up when they started deep core drilling in the '70s. Now, it's rebuilding the world in its own image." She didn't wait for a reply. She plunged the heated blade into the waxy growth on my ankle. I didn't scream. I couldn't. As soon as the blade touched the fibers, my vocal cords felt like they were being tugged by a string. I felt a surge of cold, ancient anger through the connection. The white threads didn't bleed red. They leaked a thick, fluorescent green ichor that smelled like crushed mint and old pennies. Sarah worked with the precision of a butcher, peeling back the translucent skin. "It's not just in your leg, Silas. It's a neural graft. It's trying to map your brain so it can replicate your frequency in the next batch of timber it grows. If I don't get the primary node out, you'll be walking into the center of town tomorrow morning, looking like yourself, but carrying the seeds of the end." She pulled out a knot of fibers that looked like a miniature pulsating heart. It twitched in her forceps, reaching for her fingers with tiny, desperate cilia. She dropped it into a jar of acid, and the sound it made, a tiny, muffled shriek, sent shivers down my spine. "The town," I gasped, my head spinning. "The bridge. I saw the troopers. They were infected." Sarah stopped, her face turning ashen in the dim lantern light. "The troopers? Are you sure?" They were standing perfectly still. Their cars had those green lights. Sarah cursed and grabbed a pair of binoculars, moving to a small slit in the cave wall that overlooked the valley. "If they've reached the bridge, it means the pollination phase has started. They aren't waiting for the timber to grow anymore. They're using human transport to move the spores out of the blind sector." I struggled to sit up, my leg feeling like it was made of lead. "We have to stop them. There's a town 10 miles downstream, Oakhaven, 5,000 people." "Oakhaven is already gone, Silas," Sarah said. her voice hollow. "Look." I leaned against the cave wall and peered through the slit. In the distance, beyond the dark silhouette of the ridges, I saw the lights of the town, but they weren't the warm yellow of street lamps. The entire valley was glowing with a soft, rhythmic green pulse. It looked like a massive, bioluminescent lung breathing in the dark. The trees were no longer just in the forest. I saw the tall steeples of the town's churches being overtaken by white, fleshy vines. I saw the water tower being encased in a waxy cocoon. "The river," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. I thought the water was safe. I thought it was a barrier. "The water is the delivery system," Sarah said. "Everyone who took a shower in Oakhaven tonight, everyone who drank a glass of water, everyone who let the rain touch their skin. They're all part of the network now. By morning, their skin will turn waxy. Their memories will be uploaded, and the forest will have 5,000 new mouths to speak through." Suddenly, the hum in my ears changed. It became a high-pitched whine, like a radio searching for a signal. "They're calling," I said, my voice sounding distant even to myself. "Who?" "The forest. It's not a sound. It's a command. It wants the ledger, Sarah. It wants the notes back. It realized I have the only record of its weakness." The iron grate at the cave entrance rattled. Something was on the other side. Something heavy. "Silas." The voice came from outside. It was the Surveyor from the lookout tower, the one Sarah said had been taken in 78. But the voice was layered, a chorus of 100 different people speaking in perfect unison. "Silas, the census is incomplete. We need the data. Bring us the book, and we will grant you the eternal canopy. No more pain, no more silence. Just the wood, just the history." Sarah grabbed her flamethrower, the pilot light hissing. "Get behind me, Surveyor. It's time to see if this thing can burn as well as it grows." The iron grate didn't just rattle. It groaned as the metal began to warp. Outside, the Surveyor, or the thing that wore his skin, wasn't using a crowbar. It was using the white fibers, weaving them through the bars and pulling with the collective strength of the forest floor. Sarah stepped forward, the flamethrower's nozzle glowing orange. "Cover your ears, Silas. If you hear the song, don't listen." She pulled the trigger. A roar of liquid fire erupted from the cave, illuminating the night. In the blinding flash, I saw them. It wasn't just one man. A dozen proxies stood at the cave entrance, hikers, rangers, and people in pajamas from the outskirts of Oakhaven. Their skin was translucent, their eyes replaced by swirling white vortexes. The fire hit them, and they didn't scream like humans. They hissed like wet wood on a campfire, their bodies blackening into charred husks, but they didn't stop. They simply stepped aside for the next wave. "They don't care about the units," Sarah yelled over the roar of the flames. "They're just fuel to them." I scrambled to the back of the cave, clutching the ledger. My leg felt cold, dead cold, where Sarah had cut out the node. I turned to the final pages of the book, past Dr. Thorne's descent into madness, searching for the weakness Sarah had mentioned. There, scrawled in a frantic, tiny script, in the margins of the last page, I found it. It wasn't a chemical formula or a weapon. It was a frequency. The engine is a symphony, Thorne had written. But it is built on a flaw. The mimicry requires constant synchronization. It relies on the primal pulse of the mother tree at the center of the blind sector. If that pulse is interrupted by a high-decibel acoustic feedback, specifically the sound of the forest's own feeding cry, played back in reverse, the network loses its ability to maintain rigid cellular structure. It doesn't just die, it dissolves. It becomes soup. My heart leapt. Sarah, we don't need to burn them all. We need to break the signal. Sarah didn't look back. She was busy fending off a pale, vine-like limb that was trying to wrap around her throat. Break it how? We don't have a radio station, Silas. We have a cave and a can of gasoline. I looked at my field tablet, the rugged device that had been malfunctioning since I arrived. It was cracked, but the speaker system was high fidelity for field recordings. I had been recording the sweet scent and the subsonic hum since I stepped out of my truck. I had the feeding cry on my drive, but I needed a way to amplify it. I needed to reach the mother tree. The lookout tower, I shouted. The old radio transmitter. It's still connected to the emergency broadcast system for the whole county. That tower is 10 miles back, through a forest that wants to eat your soul. Sarah ducked as a charred hand reached through the grate. And you can barely walk. Then we make a distraction, I said, looking at the butane stove and the extra fuel tanks Sarah had stockpiled. We don't need to outrun them. We just need to make them think the data is burning. Sarah looked at the ledger, then at me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of hope in her scarred face. You're a suicidal idiot, Silas. I like that. I've been waiting 40 years to give this place a reason to scream. She handed me a small, handheld radio. This is on a closed circuit. If you make it to the tower, signal me. I'll blow the fuel tanks here. The explosion will draw every fiber in the sector toward this cave. It'll give you a 5-minute window to climb that tower and play your music. What about you? I asked. Sarah smiled, a grim, toothless grin. She adjusted the strap of her flamethrower. I've been part of this forest for too long, Silas. I can feel the roots in my own bones now. I'm not leaving. I'm just going to make sure I'm the loudest thing that ever died in Appalachian history. She kicked the side door of the cave, a narrow crevice hidden by a waterfall open. Go, before the troopers find the scent. I dove into the freezing water behind the cave, the ledger wrapped in plastic against my chest. As I looked back, I saw Sarah standing at the iron grate, a wall of fire in her hands, facing an army of pale, waxy things that were once her neighbors. The hum in my leg started again, but this time I didn't fight it. I used the vibration to sense where the veins were thickest in the soil, weaving through the dark like a ghost. I wasn't Silas the Surveyor anymore. I was a parasite running through the veins of a god, carrying a virus that could tear it apart. I reached the base of the ridge leading to the lookout tower, but I wasn't alone. Standing in my way was my own Ford F-150. It had been completely reconstructed. The metal was now bone. The glass was now membrane. And sitting in the driver's seat, staring at me with my own eyes, was a perfect duplicate of myself. "Give us the book, Silas," the mirror Silas said. its voice a perfect, terrifying echo of my own. Why fight the canopy? The world outside is loud and painful and dying. Here, we are forever. I didn't speak. I pulled the flare gun, the very last shell. I didn't aim for the duplicate. I aimed for the gas tank, the biological heart of the truck thing. "Let's see how you handle a fever," I whispered. The flare hit the biological gas tank of the truck thing with a sickening thump. It didn't explode like gasoline. It erupted in a fountain of boiling, acidic bile. The mirror Silas screamed, a sound that was half human, half radio static, as its waxy skin began to slough off in great, steaming sheets. The truck creature thrashed, its bone chassis snapping and twisting as it tried to reform, but the magnesium fire was too hot. I didn't stay to watch it die. I scrambled past the wreckage, my lungs burning, my dead leg dragging like a piece of timber. The climb back up the ridge to the fire lookout tower felt like a journey through a nightmare. The forest knew what I was doing. The ground didn't just vibrate anymore. It heaved. Massive white roots as thick as bridge cables burst from the earth, whipping through the air to intercept me. Every step was a battle against a landscape that was actively trying to trip, crush, or absorb me. I reached the base of the tower. The steel legs were almost entirely encased in a pulsing, fleshy sheath. It looked less like a tower now, and more like a massive skeletal finger pointing at the moon. I began to climb. "Silas, do it now!" Sarah's voice crackled through the handheld radio. In the distance, at the mouth of the cave, a massive fireball lit up the valley. The explosion was beautiful, a column of orange and red that tore through the green bioluminescent fog. I saw the forest giants, the lumbering oak mockeries, stop in their tracks. Their massive heads turned as one toward the cave. The hive mind had been baited. "Goodbye, Sarah," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes as I reached the cabin at the top. The cabin was a tomb. The surveyor who'd been hanging from the ceiling was gone. Only his empty, waxy husk remained. The radio equipment was covered in a layer of white mold, but the red power light on the transmitter was flickering. It was drawing energy from the forest itself. I pulled out my field tablet. My hands were shaking. I plugged the auxiliary cable into the transmitter's input. I found the file. Recording 04 Sector 4 subsonic dot wave. I didn't just play it. I opened my editing software and applied the invert phase filter, just as Thorne's notes had instructed. This was the reverse cry, the acoustic anti-venom. I looked out the window. The valley was a sea of white fibers. In the center, a mile away, the mother tree was rising. It was a terrifying spire of white biomass, 1,000 feet tall, its canopy reaching for the clouds like a hungry mouth. It was preparing to release its spores. If those spores hit the upper atmosphere, Oak Haven wouldn't be the end. It would be the beginning of a global harvest. "Silas, stop!" The voice was no longer outside. It was inside my head. The white filaments in my leg were vibrating in sympathy with the mother tree. My vision began to blur. My skin started to turn that sickly, translucent white. I could feel my memories, my mother's face, my first day at the firm, the smell of my father's old pipe, being pulled out of my brain, like data being uploaded to a server. "It's just wood," I gasped, my finger hovering over the broadcast button. "We are peace, Silas," the forest whispered. "No more taxes, no more war, no more death, just the long green sleep." For a second, I wanted to let go. I wanted the sleep. But then I felt the ledger in my vest, the weight of Sarah's 40-year sacrifice, the charred remains of the hikers, the man in the ceiling. "You're not peace," I snarled. "You're just a weed." I smashed the button. The sound that erupted from the tower's massive emergency speakers wasn't a sound at all. It was a physical force, a wall of distorted, inverted frequency that hit the valley like a tidal wave. The effect was instantaneous. The white fibers at the base of the tower didn't just die, they liquefied. The oaks and maples began to lose their shape, their cartilage structures melting into a gray, gelatinous sludge. The mother tree shrieked, a sound so loud it shattered every window in the lookout cabin. I watched as the great spire began to wilt. The waxy membranes tore open, spilling millions of unformed, useless spores into the mud. The green bioluminescence flickered and died, replaced by a cold, natural darkness. The forest was screaming, not in anger, but in a massive systemic cellular collapse. But the tower was collapsing too. With its biological supports melted, the rusted steel legs gave way. I felt the cabin tilt, then plummet toward the dissolving forest floor below. I woke up in a world of gray. The fall should have killed me, but the forest, in its final, desperate act of liquefaction, had turned the ground into a thick, gelatinous cushion of cellular sludge. I was buried waist-deep in a cold, viscous soup that used to be 100-year-old grove of oaks. The silence was absolute. No humming, no sweet scent, no radio static. Just the wet, heavy sound of millions of gallons of biological matter settling into the valley floor. I dragged myself out of the muck, my muscles screaming. My left leg, the one Sarah had operated on, was a mess of scar tissue and blackened skin, but the white filaments were gone. They had dissolved along with their mother. I looked toward the center of the valley. The great spire, the mother tree, was a skeletal ruin of blackened cartilage, smoking in the cold morning air. Oak Haven, visible in the distance, no longer glowed green. It sat dark and still, a town made of melting wax under a rising sun. I reached for my vest. The ledger was still there, though soaked in gray slime. I began to walk. It took me 10 hours to reach the edge of the blind sector, crawling through the graveyard of a god. 2 days later, I was found by a National Guard search party on the shoulder of Route 12. They said I was delirious, screaming about the wood and the frequency. They took me to a military hospital in Asheville, treated me for severe chemical exposure, and told me that a localized seismic event, followed by a massive fungal blight, had destroyed Sector 4 and the town of Oak Haven. A tragic natural disaster, the colonel had said, his eyes as cold as the limestone in the cave. They took my field tablet. They took my clothes. But they didn't find the ledger. I had buried it in a plastic bag beneath a bridge 5 miles outside the sector, marking the spot with a surveyor's spike. Now, I'm sitting in a small apartment in Seattle, as far from the Appalachian ridges as I can get. My leg still aches when it rains, and sometimes, when I'm in a crowded room, I find myself holding my breath, listening for a hum that isn't there. The government officially declared Sector 4 a dead zone, fenced it off, and labeled it a Superfund site. They think they won. They think the reverse frequency cleaned the slate. But they're wrong. Last night, I was looking at a satellite map of the Pacific Northwest. I was looking at a small, unmapped valley just north of the Cascades. And there, in the high-resolution imagery, I saw it. A circular pattern of fallen trees. I walked to my bathroom and looked in the mirror. I pulled back my eyelid. At first, it looked like a normal capillary. But then, it twitched. A tiny, hair-thin fiber of translucent white, pulsating in a rhythm that didn't match my heart. The frequency didn't kill the organism. It just forced it to change its station. It's no longer mimicking the forest. It's no longer building houses of skin. It realized that the most efficient way to spread isn't through the soil or the water. It's through the one thing we can't stop. Our stories. As I type this, as you read these words, the frequency is already in your mind. The sweet scent you thought you smelled while reading. That wasn't your imagination. It's the spore, waiting for the right vibration to wake up. My name is Silas. I was a surveyor, and I just realized that I didn't save the world. I just helped the forest find a better way to get inside you. Don't look at the trees, and for God's sake, don't listen to the silence.